Well, that story is in tomorrow's newspapers. This is a headline in the Sunday Express. Brexit budget to unite Britain. We'll take a first look at the front pages in our press preview at 10:30 and 11:30 with the writer and columnist Christina Patterson and the writer Benedict Spence. Well, that was Sky News at 10. Coming up, the press preview, including this story on the front of the Telegraph for you, the budget to get the UK's broadband up to speed. That would be nice, wouldn't it? Tonight we're joined by the writer and columnist Christina Patterson and the writer Benedict Spence. It's all coming up in just a couple of minutes. This is the press preview, a first look at the newspapers as they reach us here at Sky Centre, and we'll look at those in the next 30 minutes with the writer and columnist Christina Patterson and the writer Benedict Spence. Good to see you both. Before we do that, let's have a look at the front pages for you, and starting with the Sunday Times. It leads with the latest US mass shooting, this one, Pittsburgh, in a synagogue. It also features the breaking news about the helicopter crash in Leicester. The Observer has its own investigation into universal credit, which it says found the welfare system is fueling homelessness. The Sunday Express looks at the budget on Monday. The Chancellor plans, it says, will supercharge the economy and unite post-Brexit Britain. The budget's in the Sunday Telegraph as well, focusing on the Chancellor's plans to improve broadband in the UK. Well wishes for Glenn Hoddle making the Daily Star Sunday, the former England manager in hospital after falling ill, said to be in a serious condition. The Mail on Sunday has Sir Philip Green's denial of allegations of sexual assault and racist bullying that have been made against him. OK, let's talk through some of those then with Christina Patterson and Benedict Spence. Could we start with the front of the Sunday Times, looking at Pittsburgh and this awful shooting?
Well, it's been a terrible week in America. I mean, almost every week at the moment is a terrible week in America, but this really has been a terrible week with a huge Trump supporter, first of all, sending bombs to practically every Democrat he could think of. And then today, this horrific slaughter in a synagogue where it looks as though at least 7 people have been killed. And unfortunately, these things occur with, alarming regularity, but there hasn't been one targeted specifically at Jews in a synagogue, or not that I can remember. And unfortunately, as always, Donald Trump's response has been woeful, and his response has actually been to say they should have had armed guards in the synagogue, as if every single place should have people with guns roaming around it, patrolling them. And I assume that this is partly, yet again, his desire not to cause any kind of offence to the NRA, the National Rifle Association. But it's a terrible day, and I'm sure that many Jews in the United States will be feeling unsafe at the moment. And for Donald Trump to add insult to injury in this way is, pretty shocking. Well, actually, I'd like to say it's shocking. It isn't shocking. It's not surprising at all, but it's sad.
And yet he does seem shaken by the statement he's given, and talking of the pure evil. Does seem to be perhaps more heartfelt, more shaken in himself than he has been with other shootings.
He's as the wind blows, isn't he? If you look at his response to the Khashoggi murder, he literally, every 5 minutes, he was coming up with a completely different response. 1 minute saying they didn't do their plan very well, the next minute saying, oh, it looked as though, that we believe the Saudis, the next minute saying this is the worst thing that's ever happened. I don't think his responses are reliable. You would have to have a heart of stone to see, essentially, people who had had their lives torn apart with serious injuries and others who have now lost loved ones and not feel something. But whether that means that Donald Trump has had some Damascene conversion, I rather doubt.
I mean, normally I would agree with you. On this particular matter, I do actually feel that he feels a certain level of horror that perhaps he doesn't normally display for other things. I mean, one has to remember that his daughter converted to Judaism. His son-in-law is Jewish. He's got very close personal ties with the Jewish community in New York, and, of course, is a big supporter of Israel. I think it's the 80th anniversary of Crystal Night this year. Just an aside, I think it's an interesting thing to bring up. But why that's relevant is that, as you say, I can't remember the last time that a synagogue was attacked, certainly not in the United States. But in 2014, a Jewish retirement community was attacked by a white supremacist. And since then, incidents of anti-Semitic hate crimes have been on the rise. They've gone up something like 60% since last year.
Isn't that odd, though?
Well,
That is happening, and that is happening across the globe.
It isn't odd, because last year, the most shocking thing that Donald Trump has said and done many, many shocking things in the 2 years since he's been president. But to me, the most shocking thing he ever did was essentially support white supremacists at that Charlottesville march last summer. And after that, we saw two African-American commentators cry live on TV. One of them was Republican and one of them was not Republican. He effectively equated white supremacists with the people who were protecting against their supremacy. Somebody was killed on that march. The white supremacists were shouting, "Jews must die." So whether or not Donald Trump is personally upset by this, and I don't see how anyone except a psychopath could not be upset by this, he has tacitly supported white supremacy, and he had the support of David Duke, the former leader of the Ku Klux Klan.
I want to take this away from Donald Trump because whilst I don't deny he has facilitated many of these pretty awful elements within the United States culture, I actually think that this is more a symptom rather than an actual cause. My issue with all of this is we look at across what's happening in Europe right now, even right now in our own country, and what's happening with anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. You look at what's happening in France, where you have anti-Semitic terrorist attacks happening on supermarkets, an 80 or 90-year-old Jewish woman being beheaded in her own apartment by people because she was Jewish. These are not actually, this isn't something that is happening now. This is not something that's happened because of Donald Trump. I think the 2016 election and perhaps a lot of the rhetoric around the EU referendum has facilitated a lot of the nastiness, but actually these are attitudes that have been in our culture, have been in our society for millennia, and they have never gone away. I think that it is the evolution of the way that we converse, of civility. The internet has got a large part to play in this. The way actually we discuss politics in this society has allowed a greater level of nastiness and has given real succour to people who now feel that they can get away with saying these things. And then, of course, when you have that, you will eventually have people like this acting on it.
But it has been legitimised by Donald Trump, and it has been legitimised in lots of ways by Brexit, which is certainly not to say that the people who pushed or supported Brexit are racist. Absolutely.
Swivel-eyed loons.
Some of them.
This is a bipartisan thing, and I don't think it's very helpful.
The fact is that it is a documented fact that hate crimes and anti-Semitism have risen since the Brexit vote. That is just a fact.
How do you define a hate crime?
Well, just ask the police. I'm talking about
I'm asking you to define a hate crime.
I'll go with the legal definition, which is the police's definition. It is absolutely beyond doubt that the number of documented cases of, according to the legal definition of hate crime, increased after the EU referendum. And I have black friends who have experienced racism in a way they have never experienced it before, even though obviously colour had nothing to do with the EU referendum. The fact is that racism has been legitimised and allowed to be vocalised and articulated. There seems to be a tide turning at the moment throughout the Western world, and it seems to me that Brexit and Trump are a part of that tide.
Well, whether they are or not, let's hope it's a tide we can stop. We're a bit tight for time, actually. Can we have a look at the front of the Mail on Sunday in Sir Philip Green and the way this is all evolving now?
Gosh, well, this has been quite a week for Sir Philip. I was speaking on the Jeremy Vine show on Thursday about NDAs, and we knew it was Philip Green, but we weren't allowed to say so. And then of course, Peter Hain spoke under parliamentary privilege. I'm not sure he was right to do that. I think that the law of the land should stand on these things, actually. I think that the judges who ruled it, there was a possibility that would have been overturned at a later stage, and I'm not sure that politicians should use their parliamentary privilege in this way. But certainly it looks as though there is a whole track record there of very alarming behaviour. Whether it's illegal is another matter, but of very unpleasant behaviour. And a lot of people, including Ros Altman, the former pensions minister, have said that he behaved in a very bullying and abusive way to her. So to me, it's a story about power and the abuse of power.
It's interesting, isn't it, that lots of people are now talking about possibly taking away his knighthood. But I have to say, when he was given the peerage, it was well known exactly what sort of a character, what sort of a businessman he was. And he was given it anyway. Now, I actually agree with you. I don't think it was necessary necessarily right that Peter Hain did reveal it. I think he might have done more harm than good, because it's going to be very doubtful now whether, in the arena of public opinion, Sir Philip Green can ever get a fair trial. But actually, in the grand scheme of things, one does have to look at the way that these injunctions have been used, and of course in the past super injunctions, the way that they are used. They are only available to a certain set of person, and they are only ever used to hide things, not ever allegations, because by and large, if there's just an allegation and there's no truth behind it, well, you've got no real need to cover it up, and by and large, it does get to be thrown out of court. There is a real clear pattern here. And Sir Philip saying here on the front of the Mail that it was only banter. Well, actually, from what I've read, and it is documented in other newspapers this morning, I don't think it was banter at all. I think it's disgraceful.
Well, it's worth reiterating that Sir Philip Green has not made any comment about the injunction as such, but what he has said is that these claims of sexual harassment and racist abuse, he absolutely, categorically denies.
No, he denies that he's done anything illegal. Well, and we don't know. But we're not saying that these are not necessarily illegal. His sexual harassment is not necessarily illegal.
Well, no, but I'm quoting from what the statement that we had, that we were given yesterday morning, and at this stage, that is something we do need to reiterate. We're going to take a short break. Back in just a moment, including could universal credit be fueling homelessness? That's what the Observer's saying. More in a moment. This is the press preview. We're looking through the papers with Christina Patterson and Benedict Spence. To the Observer, if we can, universal credit. Oh, dear.
Do you want to go first?
Well, I don't mind. It's not... It's, I have to say, I think when Ian Duncan Smith had the idea of universal credit, which was bringing together all the different benefits into a so-called simplified system, with a view that it would help people learn how to budget and so on, it was very well intentioned. But unfortunately, what it's turned into has been a major headache for politicians, and way beyond a headache, a source of significant hardship for people who are on it. And it looks as though, initially George Osborne, it was partly George Osborne's fault, or largely George Osborne's fault, because he he slashed back the £2 billion from our country's poorest people, which was just an incredibly mean thing to do for entirely political reasons. And the net result has been that people really are in hardship. It's increased homelessness, it's increased use of food banks, and it looks as though Esther McVey, who is currently the Work and Pension Secretary, has not wanted to look at the evidence that this is not working for people, and has been acting in quite a draconian way in her department. So all in all, not a happy story. And I hope that Philip Hammond, I nearly said Philip Green, I hope that Philip Hammond will, but actually let's get Philip Green as well to invest some money to remedy this, because people really are suffering, and it's just desperately unfair.
We could have talked about the CPS. I was well briefed on that. But
No, sorry.
no, but I think a lot of what you're saying is very right. I mean, universal credit, I'm somebody who has actually applied to try universal credit and sign up for all these systems before. It is a desperately difficult system to get round, and I imagine actually for a lot of people quite traumatising. One of the things that really does strike me that we hear now about universal credit is the way that it's forcing people into homelessness, into sofa surfing and all that. And we already have such a major issue with homeless people in this country, and to hear that this new scheme that's being rolled out is going to aggravate that and add to it, I just think it's absolutely dreadful. Now, the Prime Minister said at her party conference that this was going to be the end of austerity. And here we have in The Express, there's a story about massive spending on infrastructure. Well, if there is money available for spending on infrastructure, then surely there has to be funds available to deal with this, because as has been said time and time again, it is going to be the hardest working and poorest families who are going to be the worst hit. And with Brexit coming up and a global financial crisis on the horizon, they are really going to struggle.
Well, we shall keep a very close eye on what happens on Monday in the Commons. We've only got 60 seconds. Can we try and bring a little bit of levity to the situation with Boris Johnson?
We'll have a go. Well, I'm afraid Boris no longer brings levity to anyone except, I don't know, some really hardline Brexiteers. He makes me want to top myself, I must say. But putting that to one side, tiny bit of levity. kind of scraping the barrel here, is that apparently the Brexiteers trying to muster, kind of wartime spirit and so on, have been quoting Henry V and the St Crispin's Day speech in their WhatsApp group to try and put, kind of lead in their pencils as they, face the catastrophe of Brexit that they are unleashing on the nation to, give people mettle against the Johnny Foreigner as he tries to stymie our chances to get a fair deal. So I suppose that's mildly amusing.
I mean, it's amusing in the fact that Henry V was an English monarch who was trying to deeply tie us to Europe, trying to unite kingdoms, and of course his first language was French. This is a ridiculous...
Well, there you go. You know a lot more about him than I do. We are out of time.
History degree paid off.
Good to see you both. Let's have a look at the weather. Well, coming up next, we have the press preview, including this on the front of the Sunday Times, slaughter at the synagogue. We're bringing more on all of the front pages in just a moment with writer and columnist Christina Patterson and the writer Benedict Spence. But we don't want to be here. This is the press preview. We'll look at the newspapers as they reaches here at Sky Centre. We'll talk through them in the next half hour with the writer and columnist Christina Patterson and the writer Benedict Spence. Good to see you. Let's just run you through the front pages, should we? We'll start with the Sunday Times, which has the latest US mass shooting. This is the one at Pittsburgh at a synagogue there. It also has breaking news about that helicopter crash in Leicester. The Sunday Mirror goes with the breaking news that the Leicester City owner's helicopters crashed just after taking off from the pitch. The Observer has its own investigation into universal credit, which it says found the welfare system is fueling homelessness. For the Sunday Express, it's looking at the budget on Monday. It says the budget could supercharge the economy and unite post-Brexit Britain. The budget's in the Sunday Telegraph as well, which focuses on the Chancellor's plans to get the UK's broadband system improved. Wishes for Glenn Hoddle in the Daily Star Sunday. The former England manager is in hospital, said to be in a serious condition after falling ill. The Mail on Sunday leads with Sir Philip Green, his denial of allegations of sexual assault and racist bullying. Meanwhile, according to an investigation in the Sunday People, children are able to buy knives for sale on Facebook's marketplace. Well, let's talk through some of those then with Christina and Benedict. We'll kick off with the Sunday Times, should we, and looking at this shooting.
Well, it's a desperately sad day, just a desperately sad day. And it's the first time that I remember there being a shooting in a synagogue in the US, which is one that is directly related, targeting a particular group. But it has to be said that shootings in America are not a rare thing. I mean, the number that there have already been hundreds this year, and unfortunately, America doesn't do the thing it needs to do, which is to hugely cut back on gun sales. I was in America in August and went to a Walmart's in the hope and was trying to get, and I asked where the fresh produce counter was and was told, oh, I think we haven't really got any, but they had a whole wall of guns there in Walmart's. Anyone can go in and buy guns, which just sickened me. And I think it looks as though at least 7 people have been killed here. And I have to say, of course, nobody is responsible for this except the person who allegedly did it and has been arrested. But Donald Trump has created a climate in America in which hate speech and violence is flourishing. Last summer, he actively supported white supremacists at the Charlottesville March. He equated them with the people who were protesting against their racism. And these were actual neo-Nazis who were saying Jews must die, which is exactly what this guy said when he went into the synagogue. So although Donald Trump says that he's very upset, and I have no doubt he is upset, because who wouldn't be upset when people have died in this terrible way, he is partly responsible for creating this climate.
Benedict.
How a society treats its Jewish community is, I think, the barometer of how civilised we can consider that community. If we look at the history of the United States, it has it's fair to say, a very troubled relationship with race. But recently, across the Western world, the Jewish communities of notable countries have been suffering ever more numbers of anti-Semitic attacks. The US is no exception, and it was happening before Donald Trump became president in 2014. Elderly Jewish residents at a retirement home were gunned down by a white supremacist. In 2004, Ernest Holling and Pat Buchanan, a Republican and a Democrat, went on record to say that they believed that the invasion of Iraq was a conspiracy by Jewish businessmen and by the Israeli state to benefit them. This is not actually something that is new. This is a rather disgusting underlying attitude that exists in all Western countries towards the Jewish community. It is deeply rooted in two separate strains of thinking, be it the sort of the Christian way of looking at the Jews as Christ killers, or be it as the socialist way of looking at them as being global financiers and in control of global systems of commerce. And fundamentally, this is something that we have not tackled. Now, this coming month is the 80th anniversary of the Kristallnacht pogroms in Nazi Germany. We haven't moved on from that situation, where we still have an environment where Jewish people don't feel safe, where Jewish people are leaving countries in Europe and the United States to go to Israel, to go elsewhere, people taking up Portuguese passports. Some of them are even going back to Germany because they feel more safe. But even there in Europe, earlier this year, there was the case of the elderly French woman who was beheaded in her own apartment because she was Jewish. And I think a large part of this has to do with not Donald Trump per se, but certainly the environment around his election has opened the floodgates of what is considered acceptable behaviour and language, and he is very much responsible for part of that, it must be said. But this is now where we are, where this sort of rhetoric, Mr. Trump very often uses rhetoric against Muslims, against migrants from the South. This is something that is now being normalised, and in this case, this has not been promoted by Mr. Trump, but a certain element within the United States now feels emboldened that they can behave in this sort of way and that they can turn violent words into actions.
I mean, the fact that people are able to voice extremist views more clearly now, and that is partly down to the internet as well, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that has certainly played a part. And I have to say, in our own country, the Labour Party has had a very heavy shadow of anti-Semitism hanging over it for much of this year. And you know, a lot of that, I know that Jeremy Corbyn and his colleagues have tried to say that it's not a problem, but there are plenty of people within the party, and there's plenty of evidence that it has been a significant problem. And I think anti-Semitism is on the rise. And I think you're right, Stephen, that social media has amplified and exacerbated that. And it's a horrible shift in contemporary life, and what we should be fighting it, instead of which our leaders, Donald Trump as the leader of the Western world and Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the Labour Party, have been encouraging a climate in which it has, as Benedict says, become relatively normal.
I'd just like to highlight one statistic. In 2015, there was a survey done of Jewish students at American universities. 54% said that they had experienced anti-Semitic abuse by fellow students on campus. Now, bear in mind the image that we have of US campuses as being very left-wing, of being very pro-intersectionality and tolerance, that this sort of thing is still tolerated. That is absolutely unbelievable. A few weeks ago, the black rights activist Louis Farrakhan referred to Jewish people on national television as termites. I'm absolutely speechless that this sort of language and behaviour is still considered acceptable and is permitted into the mainstream in the United States today.
I don't know why anybody cares. See, why do anybody care what colour or religion or anything?
I thought you were saying, I don't know why anyone cares about the racism.
Didn't wonder where you were going with that.
I cannot get my head around why anyone gives a hoot what anybody else does.
I know. It is breathtaking, and I do think we are becoming, well, more tribal. Not personally,
and I stand by this. This is a 2,000-year-old prejudice that we've had in our culture. You know, and it has its stems back to ways of thinking that we don't even believe in anymore. Why haven't we stamped this out?
OK, let's move on to... it's in the Mail on Sunday, Sunday Telegraph, looking at Philip Green, of course, and the latest developments in all of this. I mean, comments from him in the Mail on Sunday. We've also had these... Obviously, he's fighting back against Lord Hayne using parliamentary privilege as well.
Yeah, well, it's been a very interesting week, and Sir Philip Green has said that it's been the worst week of his life, and I can see why, because not a good week at all. It started off with, well, not started off, but midweek, it became clear that and he had taken out successfully taken out an injunction against the Telegraph, who'd been working for months. And this is a right-wing newspaper who'd been working to reveal NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, which had indicated that sexually harassing and racist and bullying behaviour on Sir Philip's part. And he had, initially, that some judges had said that, yes, this was in the interest of free speech. And then this week, 3 judges ruled that it would be a breach of his privacy, which I have to say I felt was a very alarming move. I also think that Peter Hayne was not necessarily right to use his parliamentary privilege, because I think you should go with the rule of law on these things. And I think ultimately that the judge's ruling might well have been shifted. But I think it's very alarming that very rich, powerful men are increasingly using these injunctions to suppress free speech. And it is in the public interest when someone has as much power and influence as Philip Green. Remember, he was brought in by David Cameron as a kind of paperclip czar. I mean, essentially a kind of efficiency czar. And this man has a huge amount of power, a huge amount of influence. And from the evidence that has emerged, he has behaved really appallingly to a lot of people who have been lower than him in his hierarchy, and that is never the indication of someone's great character.
Well, it is. It's worth pointing out, as we have done before, that Philip Green denies the allegations made against him. So we'll obviously have to see how all that progresses. We're going to take a short break. In a moment, we'll be looking at why Prince Harry says real heroes ask for help. So we're looking at the papers with Christina and Benedict. Can we have a look at the front of the Observer, please, looking at the CPS?
Yeah, so this is the outgoing head of the CPS, Alison Saunders, who's come under a lot of scrutiny over a number of issues, to be honest. But I think the one that is going to stick in the minds, as was talked about, I think, the other week, is rape accusations, rape trials collapsing because evidence not being disclosed, people being wrongfully imprisoned, accusations not being taken far enough. All sorts, I mean, all kinds of people were pointing the finger of blame at different people, and it's been suggested that she shouldn't receive an honour when she steps down, as is customary. But what she has come out and said is that unless there is a significant increase in funding for the CPS, more of these cases are going to happen. Now, I've been very critical of Alison Saunders in the past, but I think that there is a lot of truth in this, especially when it comes to...
But it was down to, a lot of these cases was down to evidence being withheld.
Well, this is exactly the thing. What
exactly.
she says is, she's come out and said that they don't have the resources to look through the reams and reams of online messages and all that sort of thing, that they need to go forward with these cases. And I think that is probably true. It is a sign of a changing environment around the way in which crimes of a sexual nature are committed, in that a lot of these things are now done online, that there is a lot of communication backwards and forwards between people online, and police officers don't have the relevant qualifications or training to do this. And this is essential, because otherwise there are going to be more miscarriages of justice.
But essentially, our whole criminal justice system can't cope with the fact that so much crime is now online. So much fraud is online, so much theft is online, so much hate crime is online, and as you said, Stephen, evidence was withheld. I don't think it was just. I don't think in the case that we're thinking of that it hadn't been seen. I think it had been seen and wasn't brought to the trial, which is a whole different issue. But certainly the volume, it means that it's kind of, and with the policing cut as well, it's not really, the sums don't add up.
No, well, you know, in terms of the technology, it's evolved much faster than our ways of policing.
And an important figure, in the last 10 years, the Ministry of Justice has suffered bigger cuts than any other government department. 40% of its budget has been slashed. I don't know how on earth people expect the police to be able to do their job, regardless of the particularities of that case, which of course we all know. But in a broader context, Ms Saunders is right. they cannot be expected to deal with this new and emerging way of committing crime if they aren't given the resources.
OK, let's have a look at the... it's in, again, the Sunday Express, Sunday Telegraph, looking at the budget on Monday. We seem to know most of it already, don't we?
Oh, it's all very exciting. Well, poor Philip Hammond. I shouldn't say poor Philip Hammond, but Theresa May, desperate to have a little ray of sunshine at the Tory party conference, suddenly announced that austerity was over, which took everybody by surprise because it very clearly isn't. And also because this marvellous Brexit dividend that is meant to be materialising is slightly unlikely to materialise. And in fact, we're already spending huge amounts of money and we'll need to spend more, particularly if we get a no-deal Brexit. So poor Philip Hammond is having to, put his hand down an awful lot of sofas to see what loose change he can find to invest in our infrastructure and, as the Sunday Express put it, unite Britain. Well, good luck with that. I think that's going to work really, really well.
I'm rather hoping we get the whole way out without mentioning Brexit, but it is essential, of course. But one little bugbear that I have is that the Express talks about the amount of money they're going to put into infrastructure. 30 billion is being set aside for new A roads and railway lines and this, that and the other. At the same time that we're talking about universal credit having a massive pinch on small families, what I would like to know is why are we still going ahead with High Speed 2, which has already been shown that it will be an obsolete technology by the time that it is finished.
But we're told
when we're trying to find money for things like this.
Away from that particular issue, we are told constantly by those in the know, aren't we, that investing in infrastructure is key to maintaining a solid...
Well, it may be, but it's the first time for years that the Tories have talked about investing in anything because it's been slash.
That's not true. Boris said we were going to build a bridge to France.
Well, Boris wants to build bridges all over the shop. I wish he would build one and, go to another country and stay there, frankly.
Well, look, we're almost out of time. Can we have a little royal story, please? Because
yes, it's all been horribly serious tonight. And I have to say, I haven't... Isn't that lovely? I haven't heard this speech. I imagine Harry gave a speech saying... that something along the lines of how it's probably related to his campaigning on the mental health front, that real heroes are people who make themselves vulnerable. And he, of course, started up the Invictus Games, which is a wonderful thing. As a former veteran himself, he has seen so many of his former colleagues wounded and given them this fantastic opportunity. But the other thing I have to say is it is incredibly heartwarming to see two young people who love each other so much. And having seen Harry walk behind his mother's coffin in front of the eyes of the world, and he had a very difficult childhood, to see him with a woman who adores him, who he adores, it gladdens my heart.
It really even warms my cynical heart, which is saying something. Lovely to see you both. Thank you very much indeed. Let's have a look at the weather.